Hello, and welcome to the presentation of my senior thesis, Tracing Aristotle's Good Through History. At this point in time, I'm just going to jump right in and start. Beginning with Aristotle and the good. More specifically, our thesis was to write about tracing the good through history based on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I would like to start off just telling you a little about who Aristotle was, and while I'm sure that all of you watching know who Aristotle is, I would just like to set a foundation. Aristotle is one of the most well-known Greek philosophers to ever exist. His ideas and teachings are significant because they set the foundation for modern-day biology, mathematics, logic, rhetoric, and philosophy. Having been a pupil of Socrates, Aristotle formed his own principles on human virtue, and he wrote a book called Nicomachean Ethics. In his work, Aristotle discusses human virtue, character, and happiness. One such concept is that of the good. According to Aristotle, the good is for which all things aim, and Aristotle even says, quote, "Every art and every inquiry, and likewise every action and choice, seems to aim at some good, and hence it has been beautifully said that the good is that which all things aim." It is at this time that I would like to specify that there are two levels of good that Aristotle is talking about. The first level of good is the supreme good, and Aristotle defines this as an activity of the rational soul in accordance with virtue. Unfortunately, it is impossible to reach the supreme good because the supreme good would require perfection, and humans are naturally sinful creatures. While the supreme good is unattainable because humans are not perfect, one is still able to reach some good. In terms of my presentation, I define some good the same as the supreme good: actions in accordance with virtue, those who acted because of their character and because of their morals. The historical figures which I have included in my senior thesis are those who have achieved some good. To understand achieving the good, there is actually a hierarchy that one can follow. You can see that this hierarchy is centered around choice. By making good choices, one can be led to achieving the good, which is the humanly attainable peak of excellence and moral soundness. From left to right, good choices lead to attaining virtue, and virtue becomes etched into one's character. Once you have formed good character, that's basically the equivalent of having good ethics. I would personally say that ethics is the product of virtue and character. Good ethics allows for the trained mind to be able to decipher truth, and here at TCA, truth, goodness, and beauty are actually very important to us. It's interesting because they're all related, and you can see that through this hierarchy. Truth is the basis for the good, and by achieving the good, you are able to experience, understand, and see the beautiful. Once you've achieved the good, one is also able to find happiness, and happiness, as defined by Aristotle, is actually the highest form of human good. People can achieve the good without happiness, but if one finds happiness, they have undoubtedly achieved the good. In order to trace the good through the past, there must be a firm understanding about what the good is, because history is so complex. Picking out the human good throughout their natural course of existence is the same as finding virtue in a sea of flaw and sin. Just because someone has virtue does not mean that they have achieved the good, but as previously stated, every action is aimed at some good. If every action is and every inquiry is aimed at some good, then someone would logically ask about murder. How is murder for the good? The same good which can be understood as the peak of human excellence and upstanding virtue. Well, Aristotle addresses this too. He says, as a sign of the active states of one's soul, one must consider the pleasure or pain that accompanies one's deed. For someone who refrains from bodily pleasures and delights in this very thing is temperate, but someone who does so while feeling burdened by it is spoiled, and someone who endures terrifying things and delights in them, or is at any rate not pained by them, is courageous, but someone who does so while being pained is a coward. To simplify what Aristotle is saying in terms of the good, there are those who do the good simply because it is the good thing to do. Then there are those who still choose to do the good despite being pulled by the bad. Then there are those who do the bad but are pulled by the good, by a conscience to do the right thing. And then finally, there are those who do the bad but for a perceived good. As explained by historian and Hillsdale College president Larry Arnn, in terms of the good, there is no bad. Back to the main question of what about murder? If you ask someone why they committed murder, you'll get two answers. I didn't do it, or I did it because. And what follows because is always some good. He wronged me. He owed me. I wanted revenge. Each of these answers are a perceived good. Therefore, every action is aimed towards the good or a perceived good. As we go into discussing the historical figures who have achieved the good, it is important to remember that the world is not black and white, and to remark about the good done by a great historical figure without taking into account the surrounding circumstances would be a disservice to them and their actions. When someone accomplishes the good, they should not be revered simply for that end result of their actions, but for their ability to continuously and consistently make the right choice. Stonewall Jackson. Right off the bat, if you know anything about Stonewall Jackson, it wouldn't surprise you that he achieved the good in his life. Born on January 21st, 1824, Jackson graduated top of his class at West Point. He served as a lieutenant and as a brevet major in the Mexican-American War and as a professor at the Virginia Military Academy. He was disliked by some of his cadets for his brusqueness, lack of sympathy, and eccentric behavior. He was extremely quirky, and he often was comical in his behavior. Students would mock him for his hypochondria and his habit of keeping one arm elevated to keep himself in balance and to hide a difference in the length of his limbs. Jackson served as colonel, brigadier general, and major general in the Civil War at 2nd Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. Jackson was one of the greatest generals to have ever served the U.S., and even his nickname is a representation of the kind of man he was. Confederate General Barnard Bee is the one who famously coined Jackson's nickname by commenting, quote, "Look, man, there is Jackson standing like a stone wall," end quote. When Robert E. Lee heard of Jackson's death, he said, quote, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right," end quote. Jackson's character is a testament to how he achieved the good. The first thing that was important to know about Jackson was that he was a deeply religious and God-fearing man. He would always call upon God before charging into battle, and it was his faith that made him bold, brave, and courageous as a general. While his quirky personality may have led some to assume that Jackson would be submissive and shy, he was quite the opposite. Jackson put honor and God above all else. I'm attempting to make quite a case to prove Jackson's virtue, and to any other audience, people would bring up the obvious, that Jackson served the South, and the South were the states fighting for slavery. As we've learned in history for the past 6 years, the Civil War was about slavery, but it's not so black and white. That's besides the point for this presentation, but I think that Jackson served in the Confederate Army not for the cause of slavery, but for honor. Like many other generals, he put loyalty and honor to his state above all else. It is commonly known that Robert E. Lee served the South not for the cause of slavery, but for the state of Virginia, and I think it was the same case with Jackson and for many others. Jackson achieved the good, and we can see that through the fact that a majority of his actions were in accordance with virtue. By Aristotle's definition, Jackson undoubtedly achieved the good. War is the catalyst which can bring out the best or worst in men. In the case of Alvin C. York, war brought out his virtue and character. Born on December 13, 1887, York was raised in a country lifestyle and an upbringing that uniquely equipped him for military life. He was known as a town nuisance, but was fundamentally changed after finding his faith. York suffered financially throughout his entire life, but all his issues were rooted in the fact that he would give to the poor and needy, and he would continue this kind of charity work until his death. York reported to training after being drafted for World War I, and he is most famously known for leading the capture of multiple German machine gun nests. York captured 132 Germans alive. After returning home, York devoted the rest of his life to education and to helping his community. Alvin York is arguably one of the most decent men history has had the pleasure of being able to appropriately recognize. While he's lesser known than most war heroes, the significance of his actions cannot be diminished by his lack of fame. Like Jackson, York stepped up to be a leader in battle. In terms of virtue alone, York was selfless, brave, merciful, and kind throughout his entire life. He was this kind of person consistently after having found his faith in God. I don't think it's difficult to see how York achieved the good. Again, by Aristotle's definitions, his actions were consistent and always in accordance with virtue. His faith and morals were his guiding compass, and I'm very glad to have been able to mention him in my thesis. You don't need to be powerful to have achieved the good. You can be simple, and I think York is a perfect example of that. Winston Churchill is one of the most admired men in history. He is one of the privileged few who have genuinely achieved the good, and history looks fondly upon him because of the man he was and for his work in leading Britain to victory in World War II. Born on November 30th, 1874, Winston Churchill joined the Royal Cavalry at a relatively young age, and he was the first Lord of the Admiralty in World War I, and he was the architect for the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. Heavily criticized for this error, he resigned from the position and traveled to the Western Front to serve on the front lines. Following Neville Chamberlain's resignation in 1940, Churchill was chosen to succeed him as Prime Minister of an all-party coalition government. The peak of Churchill's career occurred in the midst of World War II as Hitler was bulldozing his way through Europe. Churchill's strength as Prime Minister was proven as he led Britain through the Battle of Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo, and the infamous London Blitz. Even back in World War I, Churchill exemplified a fighting spirit. After the failed Gallipoli plan, he did not cower and step down from his position out of fear or embarrassment. He shipped himself out to the Western Front, determined to fight for his country. In World War II as Prime Minister, where most would falter due to the weight of a nation at war on their shoulders, Churchill rose and proved himself. He did good simply because it was the right thing to do. He didn't let the words of those who doubted his strength affect him. Churchill understood what the consequences would be if Hitler were to invade Britain. There is one quote that I included in my paper and I will be including in this presentation because I think it is a testimonial to Churchill's character and how we view him now, looking back on history. In an age where leaders pass from the scene rapidly and without much loss, Churchill remains stunningly relevant and contemporary. One suspects it will remain so for generations. The reason that Churchill was, stating it clearly, a wise man. Not a wise man in the sense of an Eastern mystic, but rather a man who had lived deeply, with wisdom was born and tempered in conflict, tested in crisis and honed in reflection. It was a wisdom beyond his own age, a kind that transcended his times and has relevance for every age in which men grapple with the mighty cause. There never was a man quite like Winston Churchill. He was flawed and he had his own issues, and even when it came to his own country he made mistakes. But in the moments of opposition and jeopardy, Churchill made the right decisions. The good he achieved was not for himself, but for the sake of his nation. His loyalty, initiative, virtuous character is what fueled his greatest achievements, and this is what marks Winston Churchill as one of the greatest leaders in history. I included Dennis Prager in my senior thesis for a few specific reasons. First off, I've already shown you that you don't need to be incredibly well-known or powerful to have achieved the good, like Alvin York. With Dennis Prager, I'm showing that you don't need to be dead or historical to have achieved the good either. Our thesis was to trace the good through history, and we're living through history right now. I think including Prager in my thesis also proves that we still have good people in this world, people who share the moral backbone of the greatest leaders in history, like Churchill. Born on August 2nd, 1948, Dennis Prager is a talk show host, author, lecturer, entrepreneur, businessman, and scholar who has educated millions throughout his career. By age 21 in 1969, Prager was recruited by a Jewish group to travel to the Soviet Union to interview Jews about their life there. In 1982, Prager was hired to host a Saturday night radio talk show, which soon grew into a daily show, and in 2011, Prager co-founded Prager University. Like Jackson and Churchill, Prager has been a leader, and he has stood against strong opposition with dignity and faith. Prager has achieved the good through the work he has done in America and abroad, as well as the fact that he has headed a monumental movement of conservative Christian thought across the globe. Yes, I say Christian despite Prager being an observant Jew. Prager's influence on politics, history, religion, and general education of the masses can be compared to that of Martin Luther and of his 95 Theses. Luther opened up the eyes and minds of people on an entire continent. The effects of his doings are still discussed today. Prager, like Luther, did not awake the public's mind to falsehood or propaganda. He spread truth and values. Prager doesn't tell his audience what or how to think. He presents the facts and allows their minds to formulate their own ideas. Prager's devotion to his faith has played a pivotal role in how consistently he is able to choose the good. Through his unfailing ability to put God first, Prager leads a virtuous life and is a man of outstanding character. In the hierarchy of good, Prager has met every step. Prager is a prime example of someone who is achieving a beautiful life. Hester Prynne is a bit of a different case in comparison to the other historical figures we've talked about. I've tried to stress the idea at the beginning of my presentation about how achieving the good begins with making good decisions. Well, Hester's journey to achieving the good begins with making a poor decision. For the sake of time, I'm not able to go over the entire plot of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, but a condensed summary is in my paper. Despite the rocky start Hester endures in the beginning of her journey to achieving the good, she succeeds, repenting through her actions. In the end, I argue Hester achieved something none of the other historical figures I've mentioned thus far have achieved. I argue Hester managed to find happiness, which is the highest form of human good according to Aristotle. Almost immediately, we see Hester's good character. On the scaffold, she shows strength. Her strength to bear the onslaught of damning and curses from the townspeople. Her faith in God kept her strong. She understood that even though the town had turned their backs on her, God hadn't, and it was his strength that she had within herself. Hester's strength is also shown through the fact that she did not break down and reveal Pearl's father, though the town demanded it of her. Before understanding that Pearl's father is Reverend Dimmesdale, one may think that Hester is being foolish at this moment. Why not expose the father? Because of Hester's virtue and character. She was self-aware, selfless, and strong. She understood that Dimmesdale had a reputation and was a pillar of guidance in this town. Was it fair that she took the brunt of criticism while he remained a paragon of virtue in Salem? No, but that is for another discussion. Hester exemplified good virtues and characters throughout the novel. She acted dignified, not haughty, and she carried herself well. Over the course of 8 years, while technically still in exile, Hester became one of the town's best seamstresses and was known to sit at the deathbeds of the ill and pray for them. In the end, Hester also found some level of happiness, having been able to escape Salem and travel to Europe. Pearl was married to a wealthy Englishman, and she ended up supporting her mother, and when Hester died, she was buried next to Dimmesdale. Hester had no regrets in her life because she led a good life. Having achieved the good, she made one mistake, but like any mother, she most likely didn't consider the birth of her only child a mistake. Hester was judged from her lowest moment because of one poor decision. It was the town's fault for obsessing over this one event, but Hester made the choice to change her path in life and to do good and to be productive. Hester became well-liked and a pillar of integrity. She could very easily have become cold-hearted and bitter, but she had virtue and character. And from the birth of her daughter, she was making good decisions and repenting for her actions, through her actions. She was forgiving and merciful and never held a grudge. Hester exemplified consistent action in accordance with virtue, and that is how she achieved the good. Rick Blaine is the last historical figure I have in my thesis. I'm not sure if anyone else has included a movie character in their paper, but I wanted Rick in my paper because film was a part of my TCA curriculum, and I think Rick is just as virtuous as the other people I have mentioned in my paper, even if he isn't a real person. Again, for the sake of time, I will not go over the entire plot of Casablanca, but a summary is in my paper. Rick Blaine is a morally complex character, but not in the sense that he does good and he does bad and the viewers are forced to weigh his actions. He is consistent when acting virtuously, and there's never any moral ambiguity to cast doubt on Rick's integrity. He is morally complex because on the outside, Rick appears cold, professional, mysterious, and self-serving, but as the movie progresses, Rick's unwavering ethics are shown. He is virtuous, kind, giving, selfless, and he has a strong moral character. When Captain Renault confronts Rick about warning him about helping Victor Laszlo, a well-known Czech nationalist, Rick says he doesn't stick his neck out for anybody, and this is a very famous quote from the film. Yet, time and time again, that is exactly what Rick does. He sacrifices himself and his assets for the betterment of others. Rick claims he never sticks his neck out for anyone, and yet when approached by a young woman in need, Mrs. Brandel, Rick's immediate response is to help her. He doesn't ponder or go back and forth. He immediately, secretly rigs his own casino to help Mr. Brandel secure a travel visa for himself and his wife. It's little moments such as this that show what kind of person Rick is. In general, when people act righteously in the small moments, it is more admirable than when there's a lot at risk because no one is watching to praise or condemn them. When a person still upholds their virtue throughout seemingly insignificant instances, this shows what kind of morals and ethics they have. After Laszlo is arrested at Rick's cafe, Rick goes to Renault and pleads for Laszlo's release personally. Victor Laszlo is the husband of the woman Rick loves, and Rick could have let Laszlo just rot in jail and then have turned his attention to winning Ilsa back, but he doesn't. He shows respect for Laszlo. The entire famous airport scene of Casablanca shows Rick's character. Unbeknownst to Ilsa, Rick and Renault has had Renault sign the travel papers for both her and Laszlo. When Ilsa protests, though, Rick says that she has a duty and that she needs to stay with her husband. There are bigger issues in the world, and there's an evil that needs to be fought. Rick understands how important Laszlo is to the movement, and that Laszlo needs Ilsa. Rick respects himself, Laszlo, Ilsa, and their marriage. Before arriving at the airport, Rick has sold his very famous nightclub. The reason unknown to the viewers at the moment, but as Laszlo and Ilsa fly away from Casablanca, it is revealed that Rick and Captain Renault will join the fight against the Nazis. Rick gave up his lucrative business and his safety for the greater good. He could have lived his life out in Casablanca without having to worry about another day, about finances or losing his life, but instead he chose to fight and to stand up for the good. There is a quote that I would like to read directly out of my paper because it's one of the reasons I chose to include Rick in my thesis. Rick Blaine is one of a kind. The good he did on the silver screen can't be ignored. Really, people could learn more about ethics and virtue from Rick than they could from any other figure listed above because there are no politics or opinions that could get in the way of seeing his undeniably good character. The only opinion one could have about Rick is that they didn't like the film. With historical figures, there's always going to be those who have a different perspective, but with movies, there's a much more straightforward way of viewing a film than viewing history. Rick is not only selfless, but smart, kind, courageous, and he also has a strong sense of duty. He is respectable and decent, and though he wasn't an outright leader such as Jackson, York, or Churchill, it is simple to visualize Rick as a great leader. Consistently, Rick acts in accordance with virtue. His morals are unwavering, and because of this, it is no surprise that he achieved the good. We have now reached the conclusion of my thesis, and I would just like to wrap up all that we've talked about in this video. The men and women who are considered to have achieved the good are all very different people. They lived in different time periods, faced different challenges, but they have a few simple things in common: virtue, character, and morals. Each of these notable figures held honor above all else. They didn't worry about legacy or how history will remember them. They did the good simply because it was the right thing to do. From good choices, virtue is etched into their character, and their ethics are what made them stand out amongst the rest. Achieving the good is not only putting others above yourself, but is consistently doing the right thing even when the wrong thing seems to be the easier path. These figures are remembered for doing great things in history. It's because of their virtuous character that they had the resolve to act and lead and to make a difference. And that is why I specifically chose these people to represent the good through history. And with that, you have reached the end of my presentation of my senior thesis. I hope you all enjoy, and I will see you for my defense. Thank you.